has happened since then? There are clearly lots more presentations this time around about climate, lots more discussion on the topic, for good reason. There has been a huge increase in political momentum behind transition to net zero. There's been a lot of regulation, not just in the UK and Europe, but there is building regulatory action globally, and that's interesting for us to navigate as risk professionals, but it's not the reason we're here to navigate regulation. And there has been a substantial uptick in shareholder activity, pressure on banks to set targets to deliver net zero via their own portfolios, or the whole financial system actually, but since this is a room of bankers, huge pressure from shareholders to set targets externally and embed them internally in our businesses. What else has happened? Why are we on a stage together? Because we've entered into a long-term strategic partnership on climate change. Julien will talk about that a bit more in a moment. But fundamentally, we at Baringa have been spending 2 or 3 years up to that point of the partnership working with banks, insurers and asset managers on their climate risk management frameworks and their net zero frameworks. We'd actually spent about 20 years working with governments and corporates on transition, particularly governments and policymakers. And off the back of that, had found ourselves in a position where we had essentially the world's leading model to model climate scenario analysis, which was a really useful starting point for a conversation about climate risk. But we needed a partner. We knew that we were specialists in transition and in climate risk and in net zero, but we're not technologists. So we spoke to a few people, but ultimately, by far the most compelling, the ideal partner for us was BlackRock, because they have a global reach and a truly industrial-grade, nuclear-grade technology platform, Aladdin, in order to host such a model and make it available globally. So that's why we're on the stage together. What's actually kept us busy? So lots of work with government, as I mentioned, everything from advising COP's Energy Transition Council on the net zero solutions for developing economies, to advising the UK government on its net zero policy framework, to advising central banks on their ESG integration into their own balance sheets. So lots of work with policymakers who are going to set the policies to drive transition. That's really important. Transition is or at least where we are today is a market failure. It's only going to be fixed by intervention by governments. Lots of work with corporates too. We recently advised on the world's largest wind farm, Dogger Bank in the North Sea, the economics of that and the due diligence on that. We recently worked with several of the large oil and gas companies you can see on the right-hand side here, many of whom I suspect populate large positions on your own balance sheets, on the economics of carbon capture. So small selection, but lots of work with corporates, but most importantly for people in this room, lots of work with the financial services sector. So, over the summer, the Bank of England, as you know, ran a thing called a CBET, which was the climate scenario analysis in the UK. There were 18 participants in that, a combination of banks and insurers. 10 of those 18 we supported with the modelling, the scenario analysis, more than half. We've also done lots of work on net zero. There's clearly lots of activity you'll see in the public domain. We supported Standard Chartered set their net zero targets. And we're doing quite a lot of work right now with a number of European banks, helping them to prepare for the ECB stress test that's coming up in the new year. But on top of that, actually, the real work, which probably most importantly for this room, is working with risk managers, helping them to embed climate risk into their businesses in a thoughtful and effective way so it actually makes a difference. And it's that I want to spend the next few minutes talking about. And I thought what might be most useful for this room, given that we've worked, I think, with over 20 banks now on their risk frameworks in climate change, is to step through the 5 key lessons from that. What are the 5 things that you really need to get right to ensure that you can effectively embed climate change in your risk framework? Firstly, plans for plans do not survive. We've seen it time and again. You might have a slide somewhere in your plan with some chevrons on it and some diamonds at the end that say things like, implement climate risk MI. Those plans don't survive. You need to get specific. And what do I mean by specific? What I mean is you need to be able to describe for each of your impacted risk types at each of your 5 stages of your risk management life cycle: identify, set appetite, measure, control, report. You need to be able to identify for each of those combinations of risk type and risk life cycle stage what your target state is. That's about 30 statements. It's not very many statements, but they're critical for scoping your program effectively so that you can stand behind the resourcing and the budgets internally and not have to remobilize your program later, and so that externally you can say to a regulator, this is what I'm going to deliver and this is when I'm finished. Partnerships really important. The most important partnership to start with before you get to the businesses is risk and finance. Why risk and finance? Because you will find in your organizations that because many of the people in this room are owning the scenario analysis and the data that sits behind that, and all of the climate risk MI as well, you'll find yourself effectively a sort of de facto centre of excellence for all things climate. That can quite quickly, if left without finance doing their bit, with risk, effectively implementing net zero through the risk framework, so through things like risk appetite and capital allocation or capital attribution. That is going to be an ineffective way of driving the incentives that you need to drive through the business. It's insufficient to do that, and arguably you might, as a CRO, want to make a conscious decision about who in your business is ultimately responsible for driving net zero as opposed to climate risk management. Finance have access to things like business planning processes and transfer pricing processes. And arguably a transfer pricing process gives you the flexibility to really drive climate change and net zero through your business, leaving the risk function to concentrate on risk. The other partnership here is with the businesses. The key point here, the most important point here, is that your businesses and the way you engage with your businesses means that they understand climate change as a topic that will not be another constraint on the balance sheet, another constraint on growth, but be something that helps to stimulate identification of opportunities and new growth. They need to see this as an opportunity. If they see it as an opportunity, they will engage, they will buy in, they'll participate, you'll all play very well together. How do you do that? One of the best ways is to get really specific about the opportunities to finance transition. One of our clients recently, we trained 4,000 of their front office staff and their credit sanctioning teams on transition. Different for different sectors, so with the mortgage business it was all about what does decarbonisation of heat in buildings look like, what are the different transition pathways, what are the technologies, how do you finance those, how do you work with your commercial bank to finance some of the commercial parts of that. With transport, it might be about what are the transition pathways in shipping, what are marine companies, what's the asset stranding risk on different types of vessel as we start moving different cargoes of stuff around the world, and where are the opportunities to lend to finance transition in the marine sector, whatever sector you're looking at. And in the particular example I was talking about, that client engaged with their top 2,000 counterparties directly, bilaterally, on their transition plans. And they found that this led to a significant deepening of the relationship with the client, and ultimately to identification of quite a significant number of new opportunities to finance transition. And so you've got a fully bought-in front office who are going about their business very happily, having high-quality conversations with their counterparties, and in the process you happen to be getting information into risk that's useful for all the modelling. Don't rush to set climate risk appetite. So I suspect many people in this room have set appetite or been part of appetite and limit setting processes in the past. You will know from experience outside of climate change in other areas that to be effective at setting appetite, first you have to base it on metrics that everyone recognises. So you've got to base it on metrics that meet certain criteria. They've got to be robustly reported on a repeatable, regular basis. The business have therefore got to sign off that they understand the metric. They don't have to agree with the calculus, but they have to understand the metric and agree that the input data is a reflection of their portfolio, so they're effectively signing off the metric. They have to be able to forecast it, and they have to be able to control it. If you meet those conditions with your MI, then you can start putting some appetite around some of them. But start with MI, don't start with appetite, and know that building good quality MI will ultimately enable you to set appetite. And by the way, that MI needs to include not just quantitative stuff about your portfolio, it also needs to include the sort of stuff that John was talking about, looking out at the outside world, because this is all about politics and how politics is going to drive transition in different countries, in different sectors, through different technologies. That's quite detailed. It's much more granular than the sort of big macro global views that John was talking about. But your MI needs to include horizon scanning of what's actually going on in the sectors that you're financing. And finally, use scenario analysis to stimulate the discussion of the relative winners and losers in your portfolio. We touched on this yesterday in a couple of the conversations. It would be absurd to say that you can, over 30 years, forecast or accurately predict the valuation of a company or the PD of a company under a given scenario. There are a whole range of things that could happen between now and then, many of them nothing to do with climate or transition or physical risk. But the value of good quality scenario analysis is that it enables you to create meaningful separation between the winners and the losers, or the potential winners and losers in your portfolio at counterparty level. And that means that you need three particularly important things to be true in the way that you do scenario analysis. Firstly, you need to be able to configure your own scenarios. So Nick Stansbury was saying yesterday, don't just take external scenarios from some third party. I absolutely agree with that point. You need the ability to configure your scenarios and come up with what ifs. What if the oil-producing countries in the Middle East decided to suppress their own carbon taxes to support their local petrochemical sectors? What if the cost curves on batteries don't behave as we think they might do? What if labour costs in certain parts of the world behave in a different way than we were expecting? And it turns out that labour costs, by the way, are a big swing factor on when you might reach the tipping point for deployment of nuclear power in certain regions. Nuclear is particularly labour intensive. So thing one, your scenario modelling needs to be configurable. You can't just rely on running NGFS scenarios. Secondly, you need the ability to do counterparty level analysis. So you might have 100,000 counterparties in your portfolio. You might run 10,000 of them bottom up, but you've got to be able to tell the difference between different oil and gas companies. Some are going to be more upstream or downstream than others. Some of them are going to be more oil heavy or gas heavy than others. You need to tell the difference between your airlines. It makes a difference whether those companies are flying long haul or short haul, because the substitution risk as the carbon price changes on long haul flights is far lower. Short haul, you can switch to trains and cars and things. You need to know the difference between, in a mining company, what's being dug out of the ground. That has a fundamental impact on how a particular miner is going to go through transition. So, second thing on scenario analysis is the need to be able to go bottom up by counterparty and create separation within sectors. Finally, all your counterparties are going to tell you they've got transition plans, or at least the smart ones are going to tell you that they've got transition plans. They're going to be net zero by 2050, they're going to be 1.5 degree aligned, and you need to be able to tell the difference between the ones with credible transition plans and non-credible transition plans, and where they are credible, where you deem them to be credible, and that deeming of credibility is part of the magic sauce of making better bets than your competitors. But where you deem them to be credible, you need to be able to factor that in a forward-looking way into the modelling that you do, both on risk and on how net zero those counterparties are, to feed both your climate risk management and your net zero strategy. So those are the things that your scenario analysis needs to have in it. There's lots more we could talk about. I'll stop there and hand over to Julien.
Thank you, James. I'll deep dive on this last point on scenario analysis and start actually a bit with the BlackRock journey. I mean, BlackRock on climate is at the same stage than most of you. We're going through the motions. It's not an easy journey. There's successes, there's failures, there's irritations, there's frustrations, there's joys when things work. So we're all going through the same motions. One core element of BlackRock journey is Aladdin Climate. Aladdin is BlackRock's investment and risk platform that is also made available to third parties, and we're building a climate module within that would cover transition risk, physical risk, net zero, and climate scenario expansion. So a lot of the points that James just mentioned. But to do that, we don't do it on our own. We do targeted acquisitions of IP, like we just did with Baringa, long-term partnerships, like we did with Baringa, that we're doing also with Rhodium on the physical risk side of things. And why did we go with Baringa? Simply because they had, according to their clients, 10 of the 18 CBEST candidates, participants, one of the best, if not the best, climate scenario modeling platform. But it means sustained and heavy investments to get there. So a few numbers, we have 5,000 people dedicated to the Aladdin platform, not just climate, but the overall platform. We have 100 modelers focused only on climate models. We have 260 clients using the Aladdin platform, 40 of which are using Aladdin Climate. And that's the key point. The key point is these 40 and growing financial institutions using Aladdin Climate. It's not just BlackRock's own brains or acquisitions or partnerships. It's actually the feedback from all those users and the collective intelligence of all those clients that will help us build what we hope to be a great platform, and in turn, help the industry understand and act on climate change. Now, going through this journey, as I said before, a few frustrations, irritations, joys, so a few key lessons learned from an analytics standpoint. The first one is you need one holistic platform that covers all the risk types that I've mentioned, but is one platform used by risk people, investment people, the business, finance, everyone using the same data, the same models, the same outputs, the same platform, a consistent view across the organization. The second point that we learned is, as we all know, there's not yet standards that are fully established yet. There's emerging standards here and there, they're not fully consistent. It means the platform and the models need to be flexible and modular to cater to different methodologies, and you will want to try to see what is the results of the analysis if you use a PCAF approach, or if you use the SBTI approach, or if you twinkle and dwinkle and change a bit a few assumptions here and there, or how to do weightings of a metric, for example. The third lesson learned is to extract actual actionable insights. You need to go granular, as James mentioned, and I'll come back on that. And the last two, you obviously need a comprehensive sector and asset class coverage. That's obvious. But lastly, you need a scalable and robust infrastructure. We see too many clients, working on Excels, VBA, maybe a few, SQL databases, but it's not robust and scalable infrastructures where you can have hundreds of users across your bank or your asset manager or your whatever organization, where you can have a proper model governance, data governance, audit trail, and very importantly, upstream and downstream systems integration. Now, if we deep dive on that third lesson learned, and I'll deep dive on this and provide a few illustrative examples, which are actual real client examples. We changed a bit the numbers so that they're not recognizable. But I think there's a common view that transition risk is actually more of a medium to long-term risk for banks. And if you look at the Banque de France climate stress test exercise that they did, or the Dutch one, it's true, the impact is not that huge. Let's see what comes out of CBES. Let's see what comes out of the ECB stress test. Having said that, there's pockets where there can be high risks, and illustratively here, we ran an analysis for a client on their power portfolio on the divergent net zero scenario of the NGSF, so the most drastic one. And no, there's a very significant jump. If you see here, 50% of the portfolio by 2025 roughly turns into a debt DSCR below 1.1. So not a good position to be in. I don't want to paint a grim picture, but we run that across different scenarios, obviously. But the point is, if you run your portfolios through several scenarios, this will allow you to optimize and build portfolios that are resilient into different stages of the world. We don't know if net zero is going to happen. And if it happens, we don't know how it's going to happen. No, current policy scenario might be the most realistic at the moment, but being able to see what the state of the world could be and the impact on your portfolios are important. To do that, however, you need to go at counterparty level or asset level for certain asset classes. And here, very illustratively, two companies in the same sector, in the same region, in that same portfolio, power portfolio. One has a commitment for 2050 net zero, the other one has a commitment for 2040 net zero. You would think that company B is probably the better prepared to transition risk. And actually in that same drastic scenario, actually company B is much more vulnerable. Why is it? Because it actually has physical emission intensity that are higher than company A. It's investing a bit too late, de facto, to change its portfolio, and the scope 1 costs linked to policy actions increases drastically at the same time as their CapEx needs increase drastically. So essentially not going well, and you can see that in the PD shooting up relatively quickly. Company A, on the opposite, is actually thriving. Revenues, you can't really see it, it's in one of those bars, but revenues are doubling within 5-10 years, and financing needs are doubling, so it's a great winner, if you want, from that transition. Again, by running counterparties through different scenarios, not only can you help identify the downside risk for the bank, but also who are the winners, who are the losers in different scenarios, and they might be different. They won't be the same winners or losers in the different scenarios, and ultimately include that into your day-to-day BAU credit processes, and eventually, not yet, but eventually into ratings. And to finish up, I'll take an example on the same portfolio, a net zero example. So there's been a flurry of net zero commitments in asset management, in banking, in insurance, pension funds. Everyone has done, or a lot of people have done net zero commitments. The vast majority doesn't know how they will get to net zero on their portfolio. So here we run an analysis on that same portfolio for that same client, and you can see 2020 composition of that portfolio in terms of source of energy used to produce the electricity. That client is low, that portfolio is low on renewables, high on gas, high on nuclear, and overall actually, when you take the weighted average, it's actually slightly, very close to the benchmark. If you fast forward 2030, take into account all the commitments that their counterparties have done, the portfolio has changed drastically, but hasn't followed the scenario, which means that they end up in a situation where they're actually not net zero, on track to be net zero in 2030. The levers are obvious. If you look at this picture, you need more renewables, ideally, and you may want to work on your coal part. And that's where it's interesting, where you then go down at counterparty level. We've run this type of analysis on high emitting sectors for a number of banks, and you always end up, be it in oil and gas or in power, with 5 to 10 counterparties that you need to work through. The 5 to 10 counterparties that actually produce or are responsible for a significant share of your emissions. And it can be exiting, it can be helping them transition, these different ways of doing it. But the key point is running those analyses at the counterparty level helps you identify the sources of misalignment or alignment to net zero, and again, identify who are the winners and who are the losers. And to finish up and to wrap up, 3 questions that we ask ourselves and that we think a lot of organizations should ask themselves, again, in terms of analytics and change on climate. know, one, do you have a consistent view across climate risk, net zero, and across all functions in your institution? Two, are your analyses granular enough so that you can actually measure climate risk in a way that you can embed it into your first line and second line, so that your bankers actually accept the numbers, that your credit officer accept the numbers, and that they can play with it and make them their own? And third, are you able to identify then the winners and the losers and the actual biggest opportunities that you can capture as a bank or as an asset manager or an asset owner to the transition to the low carbon economy? Voilà, thank you very much, and I think we can open it up to Q&A.
People, if you have any questions. In the back here, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. The question I have is that you advocate that everyone uses and looks at the same data, and I imagine that's so because of the platform. Do you foresee any pitfalls from that with, if everyone's looking at the same thing, to spot any potential flaws or errors or issues you might want to bring in and refresh that data?
So, it was a bit difficult for me to hear, but is the question if we see pitfalls, issues with the platform?
Yeah, because sorry, I'll take my mask off now. It's probably easier. If you're saying, okay, everyone look at that data set, and we're doing that, and we're making those business decisions from that, which obviously has some benefits, what do you see the pitfalls that you need to look out for to avoid sort of going in the wrong direction or errors in the data?
I think we're in, if we go back in actual financial modeling, we're in 1970s at a very early stage. VAR does not exist yet in the financial modeling world. That's a concept that comes much later. So all this to say that what we have today is in reality quite rudimentary, in the sense that forecasting 30 years, there's a lot of model risk, there's a lot of, we know data is not perfect, so there's data gaps and assumptions you need to make, etc., etc. I think the value is not so much whether the answer of the model is 3.6 versus 3.4. The value is the answer 3, 10, or 8. I think that's more the directional answer that you get out of those models. But there's a lot of model risk, there's a lot of assumptions that you need to put in, and just the length of the forecast is humongous. And that's why we tend to focus actually more, if you think of net zero, we tend to focus more on a 5 to 10 year horizon rather than 2050, which is, we'll all have different jobs. So we'll see what we do after 2025 or 2030.
I'll maybe add to that as well, just from the perspective of different groups within the bank. You may want to anchor your ICAP report around a fairly stable scenario set, right? But your front office and your credit sanctioning teams are going to want a much more dynamic ability to be able to explore. This is risk management, it's not science. This is about exploring to understand uncertainty and the different ways in which transition and physical risk can act on a portfolio. I always go to transition because transition is the one that is much more multidimensional. There's many more, there's a million ways transition can happen. So you can do that all on the same, you should have a consistent base of underlying portfolio data and emissions data and business model data, and a consistent view across the organization of people's plans, your counterparties' transition plans. But that doesn't mean you'll all end up generating the same numbers, because you might end up running different scenarios for different purposes.
Any other questions?
I see one in the middle.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Thanks. Hi, it's James Tebeth here from Nationwide. Really interesting talk. Thank you. James, going back to your 5 sort of bits of advice on the climate change work, I was particularly interested in the risk appetite one. You talked about sort of not rushing to do that, but getting good quality data and reporting of things. Are you seeing any sort of trends or similarities in risk appetite statements that are being set, given the sort of the time frame issue is quite a difficult one to consider?
Yeah. So, of course, the scenario modelling may give you a view of what happens to PDs or companies' profitability or house prices in 2030, 2040. I think banks are largely shying away from, and rightly, I would say, setting appetite on the basis of scenario outputs. So it's not like a VAR where you're going to put a VAR limit in place. You're not going to put a scenario limit in place. We're not seeing that happen. What we're seeing is, I think in the well thought through appetite statements come from doing the scenario analysis, identifying that you've got a pocket of exposure. Maybe it's houses at a certain level of elevation or with certain thermal properties that you might be able to extract from things like their energy performance certificates and those sorts of things. Or within the oil and gas sector, it might be the upstream oil companies, right? Because upstream models are particularly transition risky. So the scenario analysis helps you to identify the pockets of exposure, and then the sorts of appetite statement that we see starting to emerge are fairly simple exposure limits. We will have no more than exposure of X to positions that look like this, which we happen to have identified using our scenario analysis. And I would say there's quite a few appetite statements emerging which are not really risk appetite statements. They're more net zero appetite statements, and they're masquerading as risk appetite. So it's people saying, well, obviously we should put a limit on high transition sectors like utilities. Well, actually the world is going to need a lot more electricity, not a lot less, as a result of transition to net zero. And therefore, as long as your investment horizon is long enough, you can identify quite a lot of absolute and relative winners in the utilities sector. So I would caution against simply assuming that because something is a high emitting sector, it's therefore needs a risk appetite statement. You might decide you want a financed emissions appetite, and you might decide that the risk functions risk framework is a good way of deploying it, or you might say to finance, you go implement that because you're driving the financed emissions numbers and net zero through the organisation.
I think on net zero, what we see quite a few banks working on is more the concepts of carbon budgets or carbon limits that you set with the business, rather than necessarily a risk appetite limit.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, thanks a lot. We appreciate it. We're now going to pivot. Paolo Renzi is going to come up and talk about SIM performance in a post-COVID world. So thank you again.
Thank you.